She stood near the far wall of the old house, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel louder than it should. Dust floated slowly in the air, catching the soft light coming in through the tall windows. Most people in the room were busy talking among themselves, pointing at furniture, discussing history, or checking their phones. No one noticed her standing still, staring at the large portrait hanging slightly crooked on the wall. The portrait was old. The frame was heavy and dark, with small cracks along the edges. Time had faded its colors, but the faces in it were still clear. A man and a woman sat side by side, dressed neatly, their expressions serious but calm. Behind them, just a little to the side, stood a small child. Many people assumed the child was nothing more than a background detail, something the painter added to balance the image. But she knew better. Her eyes were locked onto that child. Her chest felt tight. She had seen this face before. Her heart beat faster, though she kept her face still. Years of learning how to hide emotions had taught her well. No one could tell what she was feeling just by looking at her. Still, inside her, memories were beginning to stir. Slow at first, like shadows waking up. Someone laughed across the room. Another person mentioned how expensive the house must have been back then. The guide spoke about the family that once lived here, their wealth, their influence, and their mysterious history. The woman did not listen. Every word faded into the background as she continued to stare at the portrait. The child in the painting wore simple clothes, not as fine as the adults in front. The child's posture was stiff, almost unsure, as if they did not know where they belonged. The eyes were the hardest part to look at. They were not smiling. They looked watchful, careful, old eyes in a young face. She swallowed slowly. Faint smell of old wood and dust filled her nose, but another smell pushed its way into her memory. Cold soap, thin blankets, long hallways. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, afraid of what she might see if she looked away. She had promised herself she would never come back to a place like this. Never stand in a house filled with framed memories that were not hers. And yet here she was. As a child, she had lived in a place where walls were bare and names were temporary. A place where birthdays were not celebrated and questions were not welcomed. A place where silence was a rule, not a choice. The orphanage, she had not spoken that word out loud in many years. Even in her own thoughts, she tried to avoid it. But the portrait pulled the word out of her, slowly and painfully. The guide moved closer to the portrait and began explaining its history. He spoke of a respected couple who were known for their charity work. He mentioned how they supported children without families and helped fund care homes. His voice carried pride, as if he were speaking of heroes. Her fingers tightened. Care homes, she almost laughed. But the sound stayed trapped in her chest. She had learned early on that words could be dangerous. At the orphanage, children who spoke too much were often punished with silence. Not physical harm, but something worse. They were ignored, forgotten, as if they did not exist. She shifted her weight slightly, still staring at the portrait. The guide pointed to the child in the background and said it was believed the child was either a distant relative or a symbolic figure. No records clearly explained it, no records. That phrase sent a sharp feeling through her. Records had always been a problem. Files went missing. Names changed. Dates blurred. At the orphanage, she remembered asking once about her real name. The caretaker had looked at her for a long moment, then gently said, "Your name is the one you have now." The past only confuses children. She had been very young. But she remembered how small that answer made her feel. Someone beside her whispered, "It's just a painting." She did not respond to everyone else. It was just a painting. Just an old portrait in a house filled with history. To her, it was a door that had been locked for years, now slowly opening. She stepped closer. No one stopped her. Her eyes traced the fine lines of the brush, the soft shadows around the child's face. She noticed something she had not seen at first. A small mark on the lower corner of the painting, almost hidden by the frame. A symbol. Her breath caught. She had seen that symbol before. Not in books. Not in museums. on old papers, on sealed doors, on forms that adults thought children could not read. At the orphanage, there was a room no child was allowed to enter. Its door was always locked. Once, when she was older, she had been asked to clean nearby. The door opened briefly, and she saw files stacked high, all marked with the same symbol. When she asked about it later, she was told she imagined it. Standing there now, as an adult, she knew she had not imagined anything. Her chest felt heavy, but her mind was clear. For the first time in a long while, pieces were beginning to fit together. The portrait, the child, the symbol, the silence. The guide finished speaking and moved on to another part of the room. People followed, chatting and smiling. She stayed behind. The room felt larger now that she was alone with the portrait. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who were you?" she asked the child in the painting. Of course, there was no answer. But the question mattered. For years she had lived with the feeling that something about her life did not add up, that her past had been carefully edited. She built a future anyway. She worked, survived, learned to stand on her own. She told herself that knowing the truth did not matter anymore. But the truth had a way of waiting. Footsteps echoed behind her. Someone asked if she was coming along. She nodded, but did not turn around right away. Her eyes stayed on the portrait for one last moment. In that moment, she made a decision. She would not walk away this time, if this house, this painting, and this forgotten child were connected to her past. She would uncover it. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with honesty. Because the silence that once protected others had stolen too much from her, as she finally stepped back and followed the others out of the room. No one noticed the change in her expression. But something had shifted inside her. The portrait remained on the wall, quiet and unchanged. But the story behind it was no longer asleep. The woman walked slowly down the hallway of the old house, her fingers brushing lightly along the wooden railing. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her feet, echoing the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Even though she was in a place far removed from the orphanage she had grown up in, memories came back uninvited, like shadows stretching across her mind. She remembered the first day she arrived at the orphanage. The sky had been gray, and the air smelled of rain and wet earth. Children were lined up outside, all waiting to be called into the building, one by one. She remembered the hard concrete steps that led to the heavy metal doors, and the feeling of her stomach twisting with nervousness. There was no welcoming smile, no warm hand to hold. Just a stern matron who checked her papers quickly and then ushered her inside. Inside, the orphanage was cold and quiet. The walls were painted a dull, pale color that seemed to swallow the light. The windows were small and high, letting in slivers of sun that hardly warmed the room. She remembered the long tables where children ate in silence, the narrow beds lined up neatly in rows, and the strange clock that ticked loudly in the hallway, marking every second of her new life. The rules were strict. She learned them fast. Speak only when spoken to. Eat what is given. Go to bed when told. Questions were considered dangerous, especially questions about the past. Some children whispered stories of where they came from, but most of these whispers were met with sharp looks from the staff. A child who asked too much was soon ignored, left alone in corners. As if the adults hoped silence would teach obedience, she remembered the sound of footsteps in the hall at night, soft and steady. She would lie in her bed, listening, wondering if the steps belonged to someone who would help her, or to someone who would remind her that she was alone. Sometimes she would dream of running away, imagining the world beyond the tall fences. But every morning, she would wake up to the same gray walls and the same rules. There were children who seemed to disappear. One day, a small boy she had grown fond of was suddenly gone. No one spoke about him again. The staff never explained why, and the other children learned quickly not to ask. The absence created a silence that was heavier than any words. It made her chest ache every time she thought about it. Even then, she tried to find little pieces of comfort. She would hide small objects she found on the floor in the corners of her room. A broken pencil, a torn piece of paper, a tiny figurine that someone had left behind. These things felt like small victories, little proofs that the world could not take everything from her. She even drew pictures when she could, using charcoal and scraps of paper. The drawings were her secret escape, filled with imaginary places and faces that made her feel less alone. But the memories of the portrait in the old house made her realize that some things could not be drawn away. The face of the child in the painting stirred a recognition she could not ignore. That small figure in the background had eyes that reflected something she knew all too well, the feeling of being watched, of being measured, of never truly belonging. The way the child held themselves reminded her of mornings when she had stood in line at the orphanage, small hands clenched, trying to make herself invisible. There were moments when she had glimpsed adults who seemed to care, though. One woman, a nurse, sometimes spoke to her in soft tones, asking questions about how she felt or what she liked to do. The woman's presence was brief, and she was soon pulled away, but the memory of her kindness stayed. It was proof that even in places meant to erase childhood, fragments of care could survive. Those fragments were enough to help her dream, enough to make her strong. She remembered one particular day when the symbol appeared for the first time. It was on a clipboard that the matron carried everywhere. She noticed it because she had nothing else to look at, her eyes wandering over the paper as the woman checked her room. The symbol was strange, unfamiliar, and slightly intimidating. Children whispered that it marked special files, secret rules, or hidden punishments, but no one knew for sure. Even the staff never explained it. The matron seemed to enjoy the power of the unknown, letting the symbol speak for itself. The woman in the old house could still picture it clearly. The sharp lines, the small circle, the way it seemed to promise control and secrecy. Seeing that same symbol in the corner of the portrait made her blood run cold. The realization hit her that the orphanage was connected to more than just forgotten children. There was a system carefully hidden she was only beginning to understand. Back at the orphanage, there were moments of small rebellion. Children would hide in corners during chores, whisper stories to each other at night, or create secret signals to communicate without the adults knowing. She had learned to watch for these signs, to listen closely. One small act of defiance could change a day, making it brighter, giving the children proof that they were more than the walls that confined them. But these moments were always brief. The staff were quick to notice, and punishment, whether a stern lecture, or loss of privileges or isolation, was swift. Despite the fear, there were friendships. Bonds formed quietly, without words. Children learned to read each other's expressions, to anticipate needs, to share stolen crumbs of comfort. These connections were precious, fragile, and often tested. When a friend disappeared, the void left behind was a wound that never fully healed. The woman recalled nights when she would sit by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, and imagine the world outside. She imagined running through fields, feeling the grass under her feet, hearing laughter, and smelling flowers she could not name. In her mind, she created a life full of possibilities, a life where she was not measured by a symbol on a file, where her name mattered, and where she could belong. Years passed like this, slowly and carefully. She learned to navigate the orphanage with caution, to hide emotions that might betray her, and to hold on to fragments of hope. Every act of survival, every silent rebellion, every hidden memory became part of her identity. And even though she was separated from the world outside, she began to understand that the orphanage was not just a place. It was a test of endurance, a place where children learned the meaning of strength, patience, and observation. Standing in the old house now, all these memories surfaced with surprising clarity. Each memory was a piece of a puzzle she had long ignored, fearing it might hurt too much to put them together. But the portrait demanded attention, forcing her to confront the past she had carefully set aside. She remembered the way her name had been written on the orphanage forms, how it sometimes changed depending on who was checking the list. She remembered the files she had glimpsed in the forbidden room, stacked high and marked with the symbol. She remembered the children who disappeared and the silence that followed. She remembered the whispers and the stolen moments of courage. All of it led to a single thought. She could no longer pretend that the past did not exist. She paused in the hallway, taking a deep breath. The sunlight streamed through a nearby window, falling on her face and warming her skin. She felt the weight of years pressing down, but also a sense of clarity she had not felt in a long time. The memories, though painful, were pieces of her truth, and it was time to acknowledge them. Slowly, she continued walking, her steps measured but determined. Each step carried her further from the silent walls of the past and closer to understanding. She knew the story was bigger than she had imagined, and she knew uncovering it would not be easy. But she also knew that remaining silent would not serve her any longer. The old house seemed quieter now, almost waiting. The portrait loomed in the distance, a reminder of the child she once was, secrets that had been kept, and the courage she was gathering. She was ready to face whatever came next, piece by piece, memory by memory, till the truth could finally be spoken aloud. She felt a strange calm settle over her as she moved forward. It was the calm of someone who had seen the darkness, understood it, and decided that she would not let it define her. She had survived the orphanage, survived the silence, and now, standing in this room filled with echoes of the past, she was prepared to reclaim her story. She returned to the room with the portrait the next morning. The house felt different in daylight, the shadows less threatening but still present in quiet corners. The air smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors, mixed with the distant fragrance of flowers from the garden outside. She walked slowly, her eyes never leaving the painting that had haunted her. Imagination overnight. The child in the portrait seemed more alive now. Perhaps it was the light, or perhaps it was the memory of her own childhood that gave meaning to the face she studied. She stepped closer, noticing details she had missed before: the fine lines around the eyes, the subtle curve of the mouth, and the expression that seemed to hold both fear and awareness. It was a familiar look, one she remembered seeing in herself when she had been 10 years old. Hiding from the stern eyes of the matron at the orphanage, as she observed the painting, she realized the child's hands were positioned in a way she had seen only once before in her life. It was a small gesture, a twist of the fingers, a way of holding something invisible but significant. She remembered the children at the orphanage learning small secret signals to communicate when the staff were watching. Some signals were just gestures, meaningless to outsiders, but full of meaning to those who understood. Her pulse quickened. Could this child be trying to tell her something? Or was it just an echo of her own memories? She crouched slightly, examining the base of the frame, where the symbol appeared again. The mark was faint, almost blending into the shadowed corner, but unmistakable to her trained eyes. She had seen it on files at the orphanage, on doors, on sealed envelopes, and once on the matron's desk. Every time, it had meant secrecy, hidden rules, and forbidden knowledge. And now it was here, connected to this family, this house, and this portrait. Her mind raced. The orphanage had never been a place of random neglect. Everything had a purpose, a reason carefully hidden from the children. Names were changed, identities were hidden, and children were moved or taken without explanation. The files she glimpsed as a teenager, stacked and organized, had hinted at a larger system she had only begun to understand. She realized that this portrait was more than art. It was evidence. She remembered asking questions at the orphanage and being met with silence or vague answers. The past only confuses children, the matron had said. She remembered the way other children had looked at her when she asked questions. Some afraid, some curious, but all aware that they were not allowed to push boundaries. Now she understood that the symbol, the files, and the silence had been part of a network, a way to erase identities and control narratives. And this child in the portrait might be connected directly to that network. Determined to uncover more, she left the room and began searching through other parts of the house, carefully avoiding the areas where the guide and other visitors lingered. She noticed small details: the same symbol carved into a chair leg, faint marks on the floorboards, and a corner of a ledger partially hidden behind a cabinet. Each discovery was like a thread, leading her deeper into the story she had only begun to remember. She found herself in a small study filled with books and papers. Dust covered most of the surfaces, but some pages were turned as if someone had recently been searching for something. She pulled out a thin folder, and her eyes widened. The papers inside were old records of children, names crossed out, dates altered, and locations shifted. The symbol appeared again on the top corner of each page. Her stomach tightened. This was exactly what she had feared. The orphanage records were here in this house, preserved but hidden. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages. One name caught her attention, a name she had not heard in years, but remembered from whispered conversations at the orphanage. The details lined up with her memories. The dates, the events, even the small notes in the margins matched moments she had experienced firsthand. She felt a chill. The child in the portrait was not a random figure. This was personal. This was her life. She leaned back, trying to steady her thoughts. The realization was overwhelming. She had suspected a connection, but the evidence now in her hands confirmed it. The child in the portrait was more than just a background figure. It represented a life erased, past hidden, and the truth she had been denied. And the symbol linked everything: the orphanage, the hidden files, the house, and the family in the painting. Her mind went back to moments she had long tried to forget. The nights spent lying awake on the hard beds, listening to the distant sounds of footsteps and whispers. The afternoons when she had sneaked into corners to draw or write, desperate to hold on to a piece of herself. The small, quiet victories she had celebrated alone, never daring to speak them aloud. All of it led back to this moment, standing in the house, holding proof that her past was not just a collection of lost memories, but a part of a larger story waiting to be revealed. The woman took a deep breath and decided to explore further. She followed a narrow hallway that led to another set of rooms, some locked, some open. She noticed more subtle marks of the symbol etched into door frames, almost invisible unless one knew what to look for. Her heart pounded. She was stepping into the unknown, but she could not stop now. She entered a room that appeared to be an archive. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, folders, and ledgers. Dust coated everything, and the air smelled of old paper and ink. She carefully opened one of the boxes and found bundles of documents, each marked with the same symbol. She realized that these records were likely connected to the orphanage, tracking children and their movements, possibly even their identities. Her hands shook slightly as she sorted through them, matching names and dates to the fragments of memory she still carried. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. She uncovered letters, notes, and photographs, each piece revealing more about the hidden network that had shaped her early life. Some documents confirmed adoptions, some hinted at secret arrangements, and others detailed instructions for keeping children in line, all marked with the symbol she had come to recognize. The deeper she dug, the more she understood the scope of what had been hidden from her and others like her. Despite the overwhelming nature of the discovery, she felt a strange sense of empowerment. Knowledge was no longer something she feared. Each revelation brought clarity and the possibility of reclaiming the past that had been denied to her. She understood that the portrait, the house, and the orphanage were interconnected, and that she was now in a position to uncover the truth fully. She paused to rest, leaning against a shelf, her mind racing. The child in the portrait had been a signal, a clue left to guide her understanding. The more she learned, the clearer it became that the network had extended beyond the orphanage, reaching into families, homes, and records that seemed unrelated at first glance. It was a web, carefully constructed and hidden in plain sight, designed to erase and rewrite lives. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the discoveries settle. She thought about the children she had grown up with, the ones who had disappeared, and the friends she had lost. She thought about the stolen moments of happiness and the small acts of rebellion that had kept her alive. And she thought about herself, the child who had survived, who had remembered, and who now had the chance to piece together the truth. When she opened her eyes, she knew what she had to do next. She would continue to explore the house, follow the threads of the story wherever they led, and gather the evidence she needed. She would not stop until she understood how her life, the portrait, and the orphanage were connected. And she would share the truth not just for herself, but for all the children whose stories had been erased. As the afternoon light faded, she moved back toward the room with the portrait. The child's face seemed to watch her, not as a silent figure but as a guide, urging her to continue. she felt a sense of connection, a recognition that went beyond memory. This was not just a search for answers. It was a journey to reclaim a part of herself that had been hidden for too long. She stood before the portrait once more, her hands resting lightly on the frame. The child's eyes seemed to follow her, filled with the same awareness and quiet strength she had always carried within herself. The symbol in the corner of the painting was no longer just a mark. It was a key, unlocking doors she had never dared to open. The woman took a deep breath and whispered softly, "More to herself than anyone else. I understand now. I see you, and I will find the rest." In that moment, she felt a surge of determination. The hidden connection between the portrait, the orphanage, and her life was no longer a mystery. The pieces were coming together. She was ready to face whatever truths lay ahead. She stood in the study, surrounded by the papers, photographs, and ledgers she had been uncovering for hours. Each piece seemed to pull her deeper into a past she had long tried to forget. The air was thick with dust, and the light from the tall window created long shadows that stretched across the room, making it feel like the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Her hands shook slightly as she held a photograph of a small child. The child's features were familiar in a way that sent a chill down her spine. She had seen those eyes before, in dreams and in reflections of herself as a young girl. Her breath caught. It was impossible to ignore. She realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that this child in the photograph was her. The connection to the portrait became undeniable. She sank into a chair, trying to steady herself. Memories of the orphanage rushed back with force. She remembered the long corridors, the cold floors, and the way the other children moved silently, like shadows themselves. She remembered the days spent in line, waiting for meals or instructions, and the nights when whispers of hope floated quietly among the beds. And she remembered the children who disappeared, the silence that followed, and the feeling that someone, somewhere, was deciding who could remain and who could be erased. The ledgers on the table confirmed what she had always suspected. The orphanage was not a simple home for children without families. It was part of a larger system, a network designed to control and manage lives in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Names were changed, records were altered, and identities were hidden. Some children were placed with families, others were kept within the network, and some were simply removed without explanation. Every action was deliberate, every decision calculated, and every detail marked by the symbol she had seen on the portrait. She remembered the forbidden room in the orphanage, the one she had glimpsed as a teenager. Files stacked high, each one marked with that same symbol, tracking the children and their movements. At the time, she had not understood the significance, only that it was secret and forbidden. Now, she understood fully. The orphanage had been designed not just to care for children, but to manage their histories, their identities, and their futures. And she had been caught in the middle. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had spent years learning to hold back emotions, to survive by keeping them buried. But the truth she now faced was too powerful to be ignored. She understood that the child in the portrait, the photograph she held, and the records before her were all connected. The family in the portrait had some role in the system, whether directly or indirectly. And the child represented both a loss and a truth that had been denied to her. She traced the lines of the symbol with her finger, feeling the weight of its meaning. It was not just a mark. It was a key to understanding her past, the orphanage, and the network that had shaped her life. Every ledger, every photograph, every note in the margins was a piece of a puzzle she had been given a lifetime to solve. And now, finally, the pieces were falling into place. Her mind went back to moments she had long tried to forget. The times she had asked questions about her real name or her past, only to be met with silence or vague answers. The friends she had made and lost, the children who had disappeared without explanation, and the small acts of rebellion she had carried out in secret, all of it pointed to a system designed to erase history and control narrative. And yet she had survived, remembered, and now had the chance to reclaim her story. She carefully spread the documents out on the table, matching names, dates, and locations. The connections were undeniable. The child in the portrait was not just a background figure. It was a representation of her own life, a marker of the truth the orphanage had tried to hide. She felt a mixture of anger, relief, and sorrow. The anger came from the years lost and the silences enforced. Relief came from finally understanding the full picture. Sorrow came from knowing the other children who had not survived or been as fortunate to discover the truth. The woman leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. She understood that the next step would not be easy. Revealing the truth would shake people's perceptions, challenge long-held assumptions, and confront the systems that had been carefully maintained for decades. But she also knew that silence could no longer serve her. The past demanded recognition. The children who had been hidden by the orphanage deserved acknowledgement. She recalled the small gestures she had used to communicate with friends in the orphanage, the secret signs that meant safety, warning, or solidarity. They had been tiny acts of rebellion, but they had mattered. They had kept hope alive in a place designed to erase it. Now, standing with the evidence in front of her, she realized that those gestures had been a foundation for the courage she would need to face the truth. She rose from the chair and returned to the portrait, looking closely at the child's eyes. The recognition was complete. The eyes were hers, though years had passed, and the experiences had shaped them differently. The connection was personal, undeniable, and powerful. She could no longer deny the link between her life, the orphanage, and the family in the painting. The discovery brought a sense of clarity she had never felt before. The child had been part of a system designed to obscure, control, and erase, but she had survived. She had remembered. She had uncovered the truth, and now she had the power to share it. Her hands rested on the frame as she whispered to the child in the portrait, "It's you. I know now. I understand." She spent the rest of the day reviewing the documents, piecing together the timelines, and noting the connections. Each discovery brought more understanding, more clarity, and more responsibility. The orphanage's secrets were no longer hidden. The files, the photographs, and the portrait were proof that could not be ignored. Evening came, and the house was quiet once again. She sat by the window, looking at the fading light, reflecting on everything she had uncovered. The truth was heavy, but it was hers. The child in the portrait had waited for recognition, and she had finally come. The orphanage, the hidden files, the system that had tried to erase her, all of it could now be confronted. She thought of the children who had disappeared, the friends she had lost, and the small acts of courage that had kept her alive. She understood that the truth was not just about herself. It was about all those who had been hidden, forgotten, or silenced. Their stories mattered, and now they had a chance to be told. With a final glance at the portrait, she made a promise to herself. She would not let the silence continue. She would reveal what she had discovered, not with anger or revenge, but with honesty and clarity. The orphanage's secrets, the hidden identities, and the child's story, all of it would be acknowledged. She had the evidence, the understanding, and the courage. The woman stood, taking one last look around the room. The portrait seemed to watch her, not with accusation, but with recognition. The connection was complete. She had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to share it. She would carry the story forward, speaking for herself and for those who could no longer speak. The weight of the past was heavy, but the power of truth was stronger. As she left the room, the symbol in the corner of the portrait caught her eye one last time. It was a reminder of the journey she had undertaken, the secrets uncovered, and the courage it had taken to face them. She felt a sense of resolve unlike anything she had ever experienced. The child in the portrait, the orphanage, and her own past were no longer mysteries. They were stories waiting to be told, and she was ready to tell them. The woman stepped out of the old house into the cool evening air, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden. She took a deep breath, letting the smell of grass and damp earth fill her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. She remembered the journey that had led her here. The orphanage, the hidden files, the symbols. And the portrait had all been pieces of a puzzle she had spent a lifetime trying to understand. Now, finally, the pieces had come together. The truth was no longer hidden. She knew who she was, where she came from. In the full story of the orphanage that had shaped her childhood, her mind wandered back to the children she had grown up with, the friends she had lost, and the moments of small rebellion that had kept hope alive. She thought of the ones who had disappeared without explanation, the silent halls that had echoed with fear and uncertainty, and the tiny victories that had helped them survive. She felt a deep sorrow for them, but also a sense of determination. Their stories deserved to be told, just as hers now could be. She returned home that night, sitting quietly in her living room. The papers she had collected, the photographs, and the notes from the house with the portrait were spread across the table. Each document was a piece of evidence, a proof of the past that had been hidden from her. She had taken photographs of the ledgers and carefully copied details that would help her understand the full extent of the orphanage's system. Every record, every symbol, every name told a part of the story that had been kept from her for so long. For hours, she reviewed the information, organizing it into timelines and connections. She mapped out the children who had been moved, the families involved, and the hidden network that had influenced lives in ways few could imagine. It was a painstaking process, but it brought her clarity. She could see the full scope of the orphanage's reach, and she understood how carefully they had controlled the narratives of the children who had passed through its halls as she worked. Memories surfaced that she had long tried to forget. She remembered the first night she had arrived at the orphanage, the fear and uncertainty and the cold silence of the rooms. She remembered the small acts of kindness, the hidden notes of encouragement, and the secret signals she and the other children had used to communicate. Those memories, though painful, were now part of the evidence. They were proof of resilience, courage, and the will to survive in a place designed to erase identity. The woman realized that uncovering the truth was not enough. She had to share it. The children who had been hidden, forgotten, or silenced deserved recognition. Their lives, their struggles, and their courage could not be erased. She decided to reach out to organizations that worked with former orphanage children, historians and journalists who could help bring the story to light. She understood that the journey would be difficult, but it was necessary. In the following days, she contacted people who could help. She shared the photographs, the notes, and the evidence she had gathered. She explained the connections between the orphanage, the hidden records, and the network that had controlled the children's lives. Some people were shocked, others skeptical, but most were deeply moved by the story. They began to ask questions, follow leads, and uncover additional information that supported her findings. She also reached out to former children of the orphanage, those who had scattered across different cities and countries. Some responded with gratitude, others with disbelief. Many had carried fragments of memory, questions, and pain for decades. Through her, they found validation. Through her, they began to reclaim their stories. One afternoon, she received a message from someone she had not expected, a former caretaker from the orphanage. The message was brief but significant. The caretaker admitted that there had been a system, that the children had been moved, and that records had been intentionally obscured. They expressed regret for the role they had played and offered information that filled in some of the gaps in her research. It was a small but meaningful step toward understanding the full picture. As the weeks passed, the woman continued to gather information and connect with others. She visited former homes of children who had been adopted or moved, meeting them and hearing their stories. Some had lived unaware of the past. Others had always suspected something had been hidden. Together, they pieced together fragments of history, creating a tapestry of lives that had once been erased. Throughout it all, the portrait remained in her mind. She thought of the child in the background, once silent and hidden, now recognized and remembered. She understood that the painting was more than art. It was a witness, a record of what had been concealed, and a symbol of resilience. Each time she thought of it, she felt a sense of connection, as if the child in the painting was standing with her. Watching over the process of truth and recognition, her own life began to change as well. She felt a sense of empowerment she had never experienced before. The years of uncertainty, fear, and silence were giving way to clarity and purpose. She found herself speaking more openly about her past, sharing her experiences with friends, colleagues, and those who would listen. She no longer felt the need to hide or protect herself from the shadows of the orphanage. She had faced them and reclaimed her story. In quiet moments, she reflected on the journey she had taken. She thought of the first time she had stood before the portrait, the initial recognition, and the growing understanding of the hidden connections. She remembered the fear, the confusion, and the hesitation that had once held her back. And she thought of the courage it had taken to continue, to search for answers, and to confront the truth. The woman realized that healing was a process, not an event. She carried the weight of the past, but she also carried the power of knowledge and the strength of resilience. She understood that sharing her story and helping others reclaim theirs was a way to honor the children who had been hidden, forgotten, or silenced. It was a way to create meaning from the pain and uncertainty of the past. One evening, she returned to the portrait in her mind's eye. She imagined herself standing before it, not as a child, but as the adult she had become. She saw the child's eyes, the same ones she had once recognized, and she felt a sense of completion. The connection was no longer a mystery. The truth had been revealed, and the story could now continue beyond silence. As the night settled in, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but she had taken the first steps toward healing, recognition, and restoration. She had uncovered the truth of the orphanage, the hidden records, and her own life, and she had begun to share it with the world, creating a path for others to follow. She knew that the impact of her discovery would ripple through many lives, bringing answers, closure, and understanding. The children who had once been hidden would no longer be forgotten. The truth, once buried, was now alive, and with it came hope, recognition, and the possibility of healing. The woman smiled softly, feeling the weight of years lift slightly from her shoulders. She had faced the silence, uncovered the truth, and taken the first steps toward sharing it. The journey was ongoing, but she was no longer afraid. She had reclaimed her story, honored the past, and opened a door for others to do the same. And in that moment, she felt a quiet, lasting sense of freedom and purpose.